So this is going to be the Rails, or the beginning of my Rails component to the series. If you haven't watched the Ruby components, I would highly recommend that you do that if you don't already know Ruby, because Rails requires a lot of Ruby knowledge, I would say, but it also can conflate the learning that you're trying to do with Rails. So Rails has a lot of magic to it, and Ruby has some magic to it. Putting learning the two together makes it a lot more complicated. So I would highly recommend you at least go and make yourself familiar with the Ruby stuff by watching any set of Ruby tutorial videos that you see fit. I have some on this stream and past broadcasts. So yeah, go learn Ruby if you don't know it. Today, or this video, we're not going to do too much in the way of Rails. We'll create a new project. I'll describe sort of what I think we'll end up doing with this Rails project, but I want to sort of just walk through the anatomy of the project, how some of the innards work before we start hacking on it, because you will very quickly get lost in Rails if you don't know what you're doing. It'll put you off and you won't get any further. So it's a good idea to at least, even if you don't take it in and fully understand and memorize it, it's a good idea to at least have been exposed to it at one point, because it will help you. So without going too much further, let's install Rails. So as part of the Ruby series, I did say you don't generally do gem installs. That is mostly true. The caveat to that is things like Rails you do actually want as a global gem. So you can say gem install Rails at your command line. Probably already have it, but we'll find out. I work across a lot of different Ruby versions, so every Ruby version is a little bit different gem set for me. Okay, apparently I don't have Rails installed. This may take some time. So when I did mention, so Rails is actually a gem that is a series of other gems. All this sort of like action stuff, active stuff, that's all very Railsy. So things like active record, which helps you interface with your database, and like active model, action cable for doing like WebSockets and things like that. It's kind of cool, and we use that in a few places at my work. So let's kind of crack straight into it and get into the directory. So we'll go Rails new at the command line, and let's call it something really boring like my forum. I thought we'd do a forum and not a blog post. Blog posts are like the canonical way of doing things. It's like everybody does blog posts as like a here's how you make a blogging tool, and they're cool, but I don't think they're as extendable. They don't lend themselves to some more complexity, and we can do all kinds of fun shit with forums. Blogs, yeah, sure, you can do, but it's I don't know. I prefer to do something a little different. I would highly recommend reading the Rails introduction. There is a tutorial that actually shows you how to make a blog post. It's very good. Excuse me. It's very good. It takes you through a lot of the nitty gritty and the Rails documentation as well on that same website. Ruby on Rails.org is great. It will get you started without any of these videos just by reading that. But we're making this as well because you can't have enough training on one particular subject. So what we see here is we've Rails newed. It's gone and created, well, it would have created this my forum folder, and it's gone and created a bunch of files. And you can see here some of this stuff will be familiar to you. It's gone and installed a huge amount of gems relative to the last project that we did, which was that small Faraday thing. And we won't go a heap into what all of these are. I'm being told my Ruby is insecure. Okay, we won't go a heap into what all of these are. Suffice to say that they are installed by default by Rails, so you should probably keep them. So let's go into the directory and get it open in our text editor and have a little bit of a poke around with Rails. Now, Rails is a web framework. Well, it's a Ruby framework that is primarily designed around delivering web applications. There is no longer necessarily a requirement that it has to be a UI-based one. Rails, I think 4.3 or 5 shipped with an API-specific style Rails, which was interesting news to the community, I think, but obviously requested because Rails is a great framework, and sometimes you don't want to just do UI stuff. Getting off track. Let's have a quick look at some stuff. So gem file, we can see here it's similar to the old gem file that we had. It pulls in Rails. This is Rails 5.1.4, so I would recommend you use that if you can when you do gem install Rails. At the time of this video, 5.1.4 was, I guess, the latest, so that's probably what you'll get, or later. SQLite 3 is for using file databases, so you don't have to have MySQL installed. When we get into Puma, Sass is for your CSS style stuff. Excuse me. Uglifier we won't actually need because we're not shipping this to production anywhere. CoffeeScript, it comes with Rails by default, as does Sass. So if you're writing JavaScript in Rails, you're generally writing CoffeeScript. That doesn't mean that you have to write CoffeeScript, but you mostly will be. TurboLinks is a pain in the ass. I have so many problems with it. It is meant to make page loads faster, but more often than not causes issues, so we generally turn that off. Some commented out stuff. Bybug. Okay, that's kind of similar to the binding of caller and price stuff that we were working with in an earlier episode. I won't get into these. These are part of testing frameworks. And I'm not super certain what listen is actually. Web console, I believe, is, well, as the comment says, I suspect this is part of requirement for web console potentially. Spring, also similar to TurboLinks, is an absolute pain in the ass. It's meant to speed up development, but generally causes odd errors that are really tricky to debug. Anyway, I don't mean to rag on these gems too much. They have their places and their uses, and they are fantastic gems in their own right. I've just traditionally had issues with them because of development environments are always complicated. So that's kind of the root directory. There's a config.ru file, which I won't go too much into. Suffice to say that this is kind of like the entry point for your Rails application. So the RU stands for rack up, and rack is the, how do I say this? It is the web server, or the Ruby. It's a way for Ruby to interface with web servers in a common way. So that Puma gem that we had, there's other ones called like Unicorn, there's Thin, there's a few others, and they all have interfaces to rack, and rack is used by Ruby. So it kind of gives this nice consistent interface. At any rate, rack calls this file and starts your Rails application. So that's kind of how your Rails application gets started, through this rack up thing. I won't go too much into any of the other stuff in here. There's a README file that gets dumped that you will probably want to change and put stuff in if you ever commit this to a Git repo and put it up somewhere on the web. So let's go. We won't necessarily go in order. Let's pick and choose a few of these because app is quite a large folder and will take a lion's share of the time to discuss. So we'll go upwards probably. Ignoring a few of these directories because they're not all that useful. The log directory will be where some of your logs go. Your development log when you're running this in development mode, which is a mode that Rails runs in by default. So your logs will go in there, but they will also go to your console, which is great. There is a lib directory which you can ignore for the minute. There's a DB directory which you can also ignore for the minute because we are not going to be doing any DB stuff right away. Eventually your there's a YAML file that will go in here. No, excuse me, that goes in here. There'll be migration files that go in here which show you how your database has progressed through the ages as you develop your Rails app, and it will also contain your schema file which describes the layout of your database. The config directory is kind of interesting. There's a few bits and pieces in here. The application.rb is kind of like the main entry point of your Rails app in terms of setting up the config of Rails itself. So config.ru bootstraps this application. I believe that's the order that goes in. I very infrequently have to deal with the boot order of Rails apps. It's kind of all over the place in my head. Cable YAML is for all of your action cable stuff. You may or may not need that straight away depending on the application that you want to design, but suffice to say this is for like part of your WebSockets. This is your database YAML file. For the minute, and by default it's SQLite 3, which is great. So that means you can kind of get started doing databasey things without necessarily having to have MySQL or Postgres or whatever other hipster-DB thing that you want. So that's kind of, you can leave that as it is. I'll ignore some of that. This one's kind of where you'll spend some time, especially in new applications. This is your wraps file. So it basically describes all of the paths that your application has. So when you go to like google.com/boop, BOP or something, what that's doing is if that were a Rails app, it would come to this routes file and say, oh, where does /BOP take me? And you would say, oh, well, it takes you to this piece of code over here. So that's what this is about. We'll get into this in more depth later when we describe a little bit more about how this framework in particular works, because it's kind of a little tricky to go into without going into things called like MVC and stuff like that. So we come into the app folder. Well, I guess we have to talk about MVC. MVC is Model View Controller, and it's a way of describing frameworks that primarily deal with websites. And the idea is it's kind of like a three-part application where models are your classes as we've used them before, but they're generally backed by a database. So the models actually put their data into a database and pull it out of. Controllers, whose job it is to take the models, put the information in a particular way, and then push that into your views, which is basically your HTML. That is kind of the simplest way to think about it. So you have your database that puts information into your model, then your controllers push information into views, but from your model. So kind of like that. That's yeah, roughly the flow. And in fact, it actually kind of goes in reverse as well. So when you're filling out forms, like submitting forms in your website, it kind of goes that direction. It's not always strictly true, but it's kind of a nice general guide. So that's MVC, and it's a way of describing a particular style of framework. A lot of frameworks are MVC. Some of them use a slightly different acronym and try to differentiate themselves in slightly different ways, but most of the time it kind of goes down like that. So you have an assets directory. This is where you put your images, JavaScript, and style sheets, like your CSS. I'll get to that in a minute. We won't do the channel stuff. Controllers, so this is your controllers directory that we talked about, MVC, the C part of it. But, excuse me, by default there is an application controller. Again, we'll get to that a little bit later. Suffice to say, this is the controller which the rest of your controllers essentially use as a base. It sets up a lot of common functionality used by the rest of your controllers. We'll get into helpers or jobs mailers. Model, this is again your the M part of MVC. Again, this is the application record, which is the model that the rest of your models will generally use as base functionality. There's not really anything in here of interest to us right now. And views. Now, this one's kind of interesting. So views has this concept of layouts, and layouts are basically the generic HTML or the HTML that is site-wide, or yeah, in the simplest of Rails applications, it is the HTML that is site-wide, and all of the code that you will write for particular different views will go just here. The rest of it gets always output on every single page. So that's kind of the structure of the Rails application. There is a lot to learning Rails. If you are like completely inundated by information right now, do not worry. There is plenty of help to be had. You can go and rewatch this. You can go and read Rails tutorials. Or you can keep cracking and see if you can keep up. So let's do this. Let's look at what I'm meant to be doing. Make some view changes. Okay, let's make some view changes. So we weren't originally going to do anything in terms of writing some Rails code, but it's probably a good idea to push it all, put it all together by writing something that shows you how all of this works. So we're in our forum directory. So the first thing we want to do is just run bundle install, make sure all of our gems are installed. They are. We're good. And then we're going to do this, bundle exec. So remember, we're always doing bundle exec when we do these things because we need to use the gems that are installed with our gem file. Then we're going to say Rails, and then we're just going to type S, or if you want server, but S will suffice. And in fact, for a lot of us who type this often, we'll acronymize it inside of our terminals to be BERS or BER space S or something along those lines, because it gets really cumbersome to type bundle exec Rails S. So I will from now on be typing BERS, but you should know to type bundle exec Rails S unless you feel like making those aliases for yourself. So BERS, and what this does is it starts the Rails server. So you can see here, winch, yes, I know. Building Puma, so this is that web server which interfaces with Rack. And there's the development mode I mentioned. And we can see here, it's saying that it's listening on all of our local bound IP addresses on port 3000. So if we come to our browser, localhost 3000, yay, you're on Rails, cool. So we're doing the Rails thing. We're doing web programming. Well done, us. So let's make a route. Let's do a thing so we can feel like we've actually achieved something. So what we're going to do is we're going to open routes. I will navigate manually to directories for a little while, and then I'm going to start using my shortcut keys to get around because it takes a while to click around. So for me personally, Sublime has this Command P style thing, and I can look for particular files to jump between places. And you will eventually, I would recommend getting used to doing the same thing because, you know, clicking this and then that and then this, it's kind of wastes a lot of time. So we want to get a routes file, which is in config routes. I'm going to go do something like this. Root. Actually, let's not do that. Let's leave that. Yeah, okay, let's leave that. Let's do something else. We'll do this instead. This is actually kind of more useful and probably more relevant to what we want to do. So we know that we're going to build a forum eventually. And so when you think about forums, and this is kind of tying back to the classes that I was talking about in I think the first episode of thinking about like the real world objects that our models are mimicking. When you think about a forum, you should be or will potentially be thinking of things like threads. An actual forum itself is a model. There are posts within threads, so there are multiple forums. Within each of those forums is multiple threads, and within each of those threads is multiple posts. It maybe not multiple, but you know the idea is that's kind of the hierarchy of things. Each of those posts has things like a body and like text associated with it. It's usually done by a user. This is not actually a model. You don't do that, but these are the kinds of things that you want to identify, and these are quite often called domain models. You will hear them referred to just as models or classes within your application. The idea is that when you're thinking about an application that you want to write, you want to identify the groupings or the things that you will be mimicking within your application so you can design them up front and not get it wrong from the get-go, because it's a good idea to try and get your data correct from the get-go so you don't have to try and mess around with it later on. That's not going to happen the first few times or any time after that. So let's do something like let's create a forum. We won't go and do the whole stack of creating a forum. We won't actually create anything in the database. Let's just kind of get it so that we can go to like a /forums path on our website, and it shows us something. So the first thing we want to do is come to our routes. Get rid of this. Yeah, we can leave it. It's good. It's a good reminder. Now routes has a keyword method to it. It has a method that allows you to do things like this: routes forum. And this basically says to Rails, go and create me. Well, actually, let's show you. So let's open a new tab. We'll save that and come to a new terminal. And we're in the right directory, yes. So now we go bundle exec rake routes. And what this does is it asks Rails to show us what routes it knows about. So in this case, we can see that it knows about patterns /forums, which takes us to some thing here. There's a post thing. So this is the HTTP GET that we mentioned. There's also different actions that you can do. Post, which is generally when you're submitting a form. There's a some other gets which look like they are for creating new forums. And there's patch, put, and delete, which we won't go into either. Suffice to say is this resources key tells Rails to create you 7 routes and expect 7 methods within your controller to be defined. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a little bit confusing, but the long story short is that it's basically telling Rails that you are going to be creating 7 routes to work with this forum model or class. But for us, we're actually not going to do all 7 right now. We're just going to do 1. So we can do this comma, and then type only, and then give it an array of symbols, the one being index that we want. So we can see here, that's the /forums with nothing else after it route, and it by default routes us to the controller action hash index. And so what this is actually saying is it's the forums controller with the index method on that controller. So if we type bundling to create routes now that we've done that only thing, we'll see that we only have that route. So we can come to the controllers, and what we'll do is we'll create a new controller called forums controller. So see the forums keyword here. This is your forums controller, so we want to create one. Forums controller.rb. And now I said that we were going to use this application controller as a base for the rest of our controllers. And this is going into something called inheritance. I don't want to get too much into inheritance, but suffice to say is what it does is it tells this model that it is a child of this application controller. And what that means is it inherits, it gets all of the attributes and methods defined on application controller. So application controller is a child class or inherits from action controller : base. And then that will inherit from something else, and then that will inherit from something else. And the idea is that you build up these attributes and methods that are appropriate or generic enough that you need them on all of your controllers. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a lot to digest. It's very, very complicated when you first hear it, and I don't blame you if you're kind of struggling right now. Which is why I kind of want to not touch too much on that, but just show you some code that you can write that will show you some of the, that will skip around some of the secret sauce. So write this, forums controller, and we're doing this inheritance thing, so we use the less than, and then we say application controller. So our forums controller inherits from application controller. Now, we'll restart our Rails server. And what will happen is we'll come to our thing, our browser, and we will type /forums, and this won't work. So it will say unknown action, the action index could not be found on forums controller. So let's make that action. Actions are just methods. That's all there is to them, all you need to worry about. So remember in our routes, our rake routes as described by the by this command line output, we have the forums controller. Remember that the method was index, and that's what we're missing. So we create an index method with nothing in it, just needs to be able to call it. And then this won't work again, but it will get us a bit further. So we'll refresh it. And now it's saying forums controller action index is missing a template for this request. And when you see template, you should substitute in view, because that's what it actually is. So what we're missing now is the V part of our MVC. We've created the C, we haven't created the M, but we need to create the V. So we need to create the V. So inside of our views folder, we create a forums. This is it all flows on and matches. So you have a forums controller, you have a forums folder for your views. You will have you'll actually have a forum model, but it's all the same words, and the words are actually they matter. The words and the way that they're written matter to Rails. So it's important to get them right. It can't be for room. This can't be for room controller, because then it would look for room view. It's important that you get the wording right. And these are part of Rails inbuilts. Like, this is kind of how Rails works, and you will eventually get used to it. Having this as for room controller means something else. Having this as for room means something else. Having this as resource means something else. So suffice to say, follow along and we'll be fine for the minute. So we create a forums folder inside of our views, and remember, this is the HTML for our forum. And then because and this is kind of where it's nice to think about controllers and actions. This is our forums controller, and then our action is index.html, because it's that index action. And then we add another extension, ERB, which says it's a Rails HTML file. So it can do, you can put actually Rails code and Ruby code inside of this, and it's really cool. For now, we'll leave it blank and just save it. And now it will work. So we'll refresh the page, nothing. But if we view the page source, you'll see here's all that layout file stuff that I mentioned. And you remember how I said that all of your code will go inside of that body thing? That's what we're getting here. So we can go and make one small change to the index.html.erb file and say hello world. Save it, go back to our browser, refresh our browser, and there you go. You've made an MVC application. It's not quite MVC, but this is the beginnings of your Rails. So this is really, really the simplest possible thing that you could do in Rails, but it's a start. So let's say that we're kind of ugly. We don't like it like this. We kind of want to change maybe the color or something. So if we come back to the layouts file, and we see here we got this style sheet link tag and JavaScript include tag. Let's take some water. What this is basically saying is Rails has an application.js file in the assets folder, and it has a JavaScript application.css file in the assets folder under their particular directories. And all of our JavaScript and CSS goes within those files, generally in their own files, but then referenced within that file. If that made no sense, I will show you. So let's make some style sheet changes. So we come to the application.css file, and we see here it basically describes that it's a manifest file and tells you exactly what I just said, but better and more precise. So let's add a CSS file that makes our website a little bit uglier. So we'll duplicate this line, and we'll say let's require forums. Yeah, we'll say require forums. And then we create a style sheet in here called forums.scss, because we want to use Sass. We don't want to use CSS. You can use CSS if you like. I recommend not doing that, because Sass gives you a hell of a lot nicer stuff, although what we are writing is CSS right now. So we're going to do something real contrived. I think it's background color, and we'll make it like, I don't know, yellow. If you're not familiar with this, you're going to have to go and learn HTML and CSS as well, and eventually JavaScript. Basically what this is this body tag here, this body HTML tag here, change the background color. So basically the entire website to yellow. And we'll reload that. And there you go, here, yellow background. Probably don't want to keep it yellow, but let's maybe, is there light gray? I think it is. I'm pretty sure it's light gray, or there's a bunch of keywords. Maybe it's light gray, maybe. Yeah, that's like great. That's kind of, you know, a bit early 2000s, but you know, it's good enough. So that helps us um, understand a little bit about the CSS. The same thing can be done for JavaScript. It's a very similar thing. You just add a JavaScript file, require it in here, you know, forums or whatever. But we don't need to add any JavaScript right now because it's not necessary. That's pretty much the sum of it. That's kind of the really, really basic Rails introduction that I have. I don't want to get too much further into this. I think what I'll do is leave you here. If you're excited about trying to make more routes or something like that, I would highly encourage you to go and make a few more routes and mess around with it. There's all of the model stuff that we still have to do, so we have to declare all of our domain models for later on as described in that routes.rb file, so we'll have to create that, except we'll leave user until the end because user is actually quite a complicated domain. I would recommend, for the minute, not commenting, getting rid of this only stuff. If you do, it will complain that the rest of the 6 actions are not defined on the forums controller. That's part of this resources thing. If you want to learn more about the routing, go and read this thing here that it links to, routing. It's fantastic. It takes you through how to do all sorts of crazy cool things like setting up the slash, just a pure slash root, how to nest resources. So eventually we want like posts within forums and posts within threads and threads within forums. So we'll eventually have, you know, things like resources, threads, and stuff like that, right? Actually, I think it's a member do. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. That's kind of where I think I'll leave it. Hopefully you're excited and want to keep learning. If you do and you want something to do, go and look into how you create models or how you would start working with the database in terms of creating connections and models inside of the database. A really useful tool for that, other than just the Rails documentation, is when you come to the command line, instead of using IRB, you can say bundle exec Rails console. And what this does is it gives you IRB, but also with everything else that Rails gives you. So when you have your models, you can mess around with your models and actually create models directly into your database and pull them out and, you know, do all that kind of fancy nice stuff that Rails would give you. That's about it. Go and mess around, have some fun, learn things that you don't know already. If you don't know HTML and CSS and JavaScript, go and read up on them. If you don't know about HTTP verbs, go and read up about them. MVC is something also useful to go and read about and learn about. If you know all of this kind of stuff and you just really want to just start learning Rails, go and read the Rails documentation. Go do the tutorial that they have on how to do the forum, how to do the post, because we'll be covering basically the same stuff, just with a different application. Anyway, that's it. Go and do some learning.